By breaking down the barriers to free trade and developing the economies of poor nations, the International Chamber of Commerce believes the world will be a stronger and better place to live. The group that originally referred to itself as the Merchants of Peace is looking to spread its vision around the globe.
Arbitration has become the favorite, if not really the exclusive way of dealing with disputes in the international field.
Ultimate objective is the businessmen, the SMEs that the chambers have in their membership. We help the chambers so they can help their membership and provide more service.
Reflections of a world that called for decisive action from all stakeholders to forge a positive path for development in the face of vast challenges and uncertainties.
Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, actually. It is a pleasure to be here with everyone today for the third ICC Brazil Leadership Talk. And it's really exciting for us, especially to be here to discuss trade, the future of trade, what it means to Brazil, and how do we as a country become a more open economy. We have assembled here an incredible panel. We have Caroline Freund, who's the Dean of School of Global Policy and Strategy from the University of California in San Diego, and who's the former Director of Trade, Investment, and Competitiveness from the World Bank. We have Fred Hochberg, who's the former President of the US Exim Bank, and author of the book Trade is Not a Four-Letter Word, How 6 Everyday Products Make the Case for Trade. And we have Robert Koopman, who is the Chief Economist of the WTO. So who is ICC and why are we here? So ICC has, for the past 100 years, it was born with the mission of improving trade globally. And its mission was to make countries better at talking by each other by making uniform rules, standardizing contract clauses, and all of that. But ICC moved from that to looking at trade as an engine, not for only economic growth, but really as a development engine. And I think this is really important for us to remember in this conversation today, to look past just the economic numbers and how overall a country can gain from trade. The conversation today is meant to be really, really informal. We welcome all of you to send questions via chat. By the end of the conversation, we'll incorporate those for our panelists. If you want to send them in Portuguese, that's fine. Just please identify yourself over the YouTube channel. And now I would like to turn over to Daniel Pfeffer, who is the chairman of ICC Brazil's board, for our welcoming remarks. Daniel, over to you.
Thank you, Gabriela. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the third ICC Leadership Talk. And naturally, a very special welcome to Caroline, Bob, and Fred. The ICC is an institution founded 100 years ago by European and American merchants with the aim of bringing prosperity through the improvement of global trade. They used to call themselves merchants of peace. Today, together with our three distinguished panelists, we'll be discussing the outlook, trade, and the challenges of becoming an open economy. We have been working to improve the conversation about trade in Brazil. And we are trying to present the concept of integration as the way forward. And that trade is not only an engine for economic growth, but for scientific advancement, social development, and inclusion. Unfortunately, we do have a lot of work ahead to make this argument stick. We think it is important to show that in the medium and long term, there is no question that countries benefit more from being integrated in the global economy than not being. During the opening ceremony of the ongoing Olympics in Japan, we heard, here in the Olympics, we have the deep sense of belonging to something bigger than ourselves. And as the Olympics, trade gives us a sense of belonging to something bigger than ourselves, to humankind in the same planet, multiplying healthy competitions among business worldwide, letting generations to excel on their individual talents. Jeff Bezos said in an interview that all of his companies, Amazon, Blue Origin, and AWS, have created a platform that enables people to expand their talents. With that in mind, it's good to remind ourselves that trade can offer an open platform for mutual development with countries decide to close themselves. When countries decide to close themselves to the world, the end result is usually stagnation in old systems of productivity, whereas an open country usually adopts new and better systems of productivity and broadly benefit itself from free trade. Just to put this in perspective with numbers. According to the World Bank, Brazil has had a 25% average foreign trade GDP, while other countries have an average 58%. Brazil is the 12th largest economy in the world, but it is the 25th most participative global trade. That corresponds only to 1.2% of the total global trade. On the other hand, we can see Mexico, which is the 15th economy in the world, has an average of trade GDP of 78%. And this is a high number, given not only to its proximity to the United States, not only. South Korea is another very good example. Again, according to the World Bank. South Korean economy is the 10th largest in the world. It is the 7th most participative in global trade. And it corresponds to 3% of international flows. The Koreans' foreign trade GDP is around 70%. Other large countries, considering here their economy, territory, and population, have better numbers than Brazil. Russia, Canada, Australia, Turkey, all have more than 42% on foreign trade. Another good reference number is the number of trade agreements a country has. Mexico has more than 40 trade agreements. Brazil, I have to stop and say this, Brazil has only 4 trade agreements. That's, I mean, Brazil needs to expand its policy to integrate its economy into the global value chains, especially in the post-pandemic context. It needs to establish itself in the international scenario while recovering from national and global challenges. ICC has developed the Open Market Index. This index observes the country's openness to trade, trade policy, trade foreign direct investment, and infrastructure. In the 2017 Open Market Index, Brazil ranked 79th, in the 79th position, a position that is far behind its neighboring countries. Chile was in the 24th position, Peru 34th, Mexico 46th, Colombia 51st, and believe it or not, Argentina ranked ahead of Brazil in the 68th position. And to everyone's astonishment, Brazil stands beside Argentina and Venezuela in the below average openness to trade. It is safe to say that Brazil can do more. We do not lack human capital or natural resources. We need to break free of old-fashioned thinking and throw away the motto, exporting, it is that all that matters. In a globalized world, the flow of trade are much more dynamic. You import to have more competitive exports. But I do need to tell you, our distinguished panelists, I don't need to tell you this. We want to hear from you how to overcome the challenges and bring opportunities, and how other countries have successfully become open and thriving economies. Gabriela, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Daniel. Fred, if you don't mind, I'll use the title of your book for
this excellent book right here, this one.
exactly that one. If using exactly the name of your book, if trade is not a 4-letter word, then how do each of you see it? What is its role in the world? Because I think perhaps we've forgotten what it is, what its fundamental role should be. We get caught up in trade wars and all of that. And maybe it's helpful to go back to the basics of trade and what's in your each own personal view, what's its role in the world. Fred, I'll start with you, then perhaps Caroline and Bob.
Well, thank you. And one of the reasons I wrote the book, or the prime reason I wrote the book, was because if you listen to a lot of the commentators and people in elected office in the US on both sides of the aisle, trade is often blamed for a host of problems we have in terms of declining incomes, greater inequality, hollowing out of small towns in rural America. I mean, it's a very long list. But I think, as Daniel said, trade is not just about export. Trade by its nature is trading. And before there was currency, we traded like goods for other kinds of goods, and currency came in later as a storehouse of value. So I think that we have, trade has benefited rich countries and poor. In poor countries, it has benefited both poor people and wealthier people, better educated people. In rich countries, those with less skills, those who are not as high on the income scale have benefited from an array of products and prices and abilities. And we're talking about Latin America, just for example, with NAFTA, the entire ability of fruits and vegetables to come into the United States and cross border changed and brought down the cost of what households spend on goods. So the beginning of the 20th century, people spent close to 60% of their income on food and clothing and essentials, and now it's less than 20%. And trade's a large reason for that. But we don't talk about it that way. I'll go quickly, but if you go to the supermarket or a Target or a Sears and you buy either food very inexpensively or buy clothing inexpensively, we think of ourselves as being a smart shopper. We don't think that trade helped do that. We just think that we were really clever and we outsmarted everybody and got our goods less expensive, put a better meal on the table. So it is about trade. It is about both imports and exports. And this is a good conversation to start, and this is a good group to have that conversation with.
Caroline?
Yeah, thanks. So I think one way to think about trade is as a technology for production. So, and a means of raising incomes. So a country could, of course, produce everything it needs itself. In some ways, the closest to this are probably Cuba and North Korea, but it's very difficult to produce everything you need. It makes a lot more sense to produce the things you're good at. So it's the same as if a farmer tried to grow everything she wants to consume. That would be a lot of work, but to grow one crop, sell it, and then buy the other things you want to consume would make a lot more sense. And so trade is really in that same vein. It's just a way to improve the total size of the pie, if you will. And global value chains are even better because you can specialize in not only one type of product, but you can specialize in part of production, a stage of production, and really expand. So a country doesn't have to produce a whole good, just one part of a good to be successful in trade. So it's a little bit easier to get into. And there's technology transfer that comes with it because of lead firms and foreign investment that are involved. So global value chains actually stimulate growth even more than just standard trade. So really, it's a way of raising incomes and, of course, lowering prices, exactly as Fred pointed out.
Shall I go ahead?
Yeah.
Please do.
Shall I go ahead? Yeah?
Yes, Bob, please do.
Okay, thanks. Well, let me expand a little bit then and build upon what Fred and Caroline said. We all run a trade deficit with the local grocery store. And this is getting at Caroline's specialization. We typically go to work, we specialize in a job, we do that job, we gain income, and then we spend that income. And that's not too different than at local grocery stores, at the clothing store, the local pharmacy. We spend our money in the local economy, but we've specialized in earning our income, and then we run trade deficits with everybody else. So a big surplus with our employer and a big trade deficit with everybody else. And I'll tell a little bit of a story. I grew up in a mill town in just north of Boston in southern New Hampshire, and it had textile factories and shoe factories. And when I was growing up in the 60s and 70s, the shoe factories started to move to Asia. The textile factories moved to the Carolinas in the United States. They both had the same impact, those moves. One was a cross-border, so offshoring, and the other one was the factories moving somewhere else regionally in the United States. The impact on my local community was exactly the same. Those jobs left. Now one could change that out for automation And instead of saying the factory left and the workers lost their job because the factory left, it could be because robots replaced workers. This is a clear example. If you look at automobile production lines in the 60s and 70s, there are lots of workers doing all these stages on a automobile assembly line. And by the 1990s, it was replaced with robots and very few workers. And the workers that were there had completely different skill sets. They had to know how to operate robots and repair robots, as opposed to turn a wrench on a nut on putting a wheel on a car or something like that. So there's the notion that we run trade deficits every day. We trade every day because we're specialized in our job. We have trade impacts locally within a country with changing geography. There are other reasons why, by the way, you see this kind of economic change in a country. And then you have forces like automation making big changes in the kinds of workers that are needed and the number of jobs that are available in different kinds of places to work. So my hometown had a hard time recovering from that because it didn't have a plan. It didn't have a strategy. A neighboring town had a plan, a strategy, and they implemented that plan and strategy, which was to diversify their economy because it was a mill economy also. And it took the old mills and it turned them into apartment buildings. And the government didn't do it. It encouraged the private sector to do it. And my hometown didn't take any of those kinds of actions and just kind of sat back and waited to see what would happen. And not much happened for a few decades. Now there's a plan, and they're making strategies about how to draw high-tech companies, manufacturing companies. They don't employ a lot of people, but the people they do employ are very highly skilled. And they're looking at how to use the abandoned infrastructure in a way that benefits the local community much better. So, a little bit of a personal story there. It's a complex story. It's not an easy one. And if I had to boil it down to one thing, people in general don't like change. And technology brings changes, but they somehow feel they can't stop that change, perhaps. Government politics can bring change. There'll be societal fads that bring change. But trade seems to be, hey, wait a second. That's somebody from outside doing something to me, and we should be able to stop that. But as Caroline pointed out, it's often trade is a way to enhance your technological capabilities without actually having to develop those capabilities. You can import that capability. And the key is to find out how to use that to your advantage and how to make sure that society benefits in general from that kind of adaptation and change. I'll stop there and see if we can get more interaction here.
Yeah, so I like this concept of improving, develop itself based on the outside world, not only your inner world. And when I read Fred's book, I printed some phrases I called pearls. One of them says, think of an animal raised in captivity, that will never learn the skills it needs to survive in natural habitat. So that's about trade. I mean, but I'd like to broaden perspective of the conversation about trade in the world, and maybe listening, of course, to WTO's vision, was both of you as well. What would be the global trade chessboard like after the pandemic? Do we expect change, deep changes, more localized, regional production? How do you see the future coming?
Well, Daniel, I think what we're going to see is something that I call re-globalization, where the re is reorganization. And I think the pandemic along with things like climate change and big natural disaster-related events, increases in trade policy uncertainty from the previous US administration, but that's also been the case with many other governments globally. I think what we're seeing is a rebalancing of firms' focus on pure efficiency gains, producing at the lowest possible, the highest quality at the lowest possible cost, which often means concentrating your trade in a particular good with one business or one small group of businesses. And I think you're going to see that they're going to diversify, and they're going to diversify across geography. So they're not as at risk by geographic concentration, and they're probably going to diversify some in terms of the sources of suppliers. Some of that may mean regional or nearshoring. I don't think it means much reshoring. So I think you're going to see this reorganization. I don't think it's going to be massive, by the way. I think we've already seen some of it starting long before the trade policy uncertainty and the COVID pandemic. But and this is always happening in global trade. There's changing comparative advantage and changing trade flows. But I think this big focus on risk versus efficiency trade-off is going to be in the mindset of more firms. That offers opportunities for countries like Brazil, by the way. So I think, you know, Brazilian entrepreneurs should be looking to see how they can be a source of this diversification that many multinational corporations and lead corporations are going to be looking for. I'll stop there.
Can I come in on that?
Of course, please.
Yeah, because I'm going to agree and disagree with Bob. I agree that there'll be some reorganization. But where I want to disagree is around the nearshoring. I just don't know that there's lots of evidence. People are talking about it a lot, but I don't know that there's lots of evidence that will happen, or diversification. So one thing we did, I did with some colleagues at the World Bank, is we looked at what happened in the aftermath of the big earthquake in Japan that really disrupted value chains, especially in automotives. And what we found was there was a big reorganization. So companies did move out of Japan following this event, but they didn't reshore or nearshore, nor did they diversify their sources of supply. They shift to lower cost suppliers. Now, granted, this is history, and that was the chasing of efficiencies, but companies at that time also had shortages of goods. They could have thought, let me bring them to a few different places so that doesn't happen again. But they didn't. They moved in the same kind of design, but out of Japan. So I think there will be a reorganization, but I think it's going to be assuming the tensions between US and China remain or even escalate, as seems likely. My guess is it will be a supply chain around US and the West, and a supply chain a bit around China, a bit of movement out of China in some of the goods where companies are especially dependent on China, perhaps similarly from China away from the US. But where I'm going to agree again with Bob is there is a place for Brazil to benefit. So when we looked at where importers moved when after the Japan shock, they moved to low-cost suppliers and to large economies. So Brazil is a large economy, could be a low-cost supplier, but in order to achieve that, and Daniel, you're going to know better than any of us, there are a lot of business climate type of constraints in Brazil that would need to be changed. companies want countries where they can move goods in and out really easily, where the infrastructure is really good, where there's not a lot of paperwork. So right now, the big beneficiary is Vietnam, and they want an educated workforce, relatively. So these are the kinds of things where if Brazil wants to benefit, it can't just sit back. And I'll stop there.
Thank you. Fred, would you like to add?
Yeah, I also, I think that one of the things that this pandemic has done is it gives people a ready reason or excuse. There are many factors and factions in our economy that have wanted to reshore and bring manufacturing back. So this becomes a perfect reason to do so. So I agree also with Caroline. I think that there will be some movement in that direction, but I think it's really more about a political predisposition to that versus the actual economics of it. And, even when it comes to COVID, and I did put this in the book, this global pandemic required ventilators, for example. So there's a lot of talk we should be making ventilators. Well, the next pandemic may not require ventilators. So we can't just fight the quote unquote last battle. What if we learn something from this pandemic and this crisis globally is on certain things, you need a stockpile and you need alternatives. I use the example, if you drive to work every day and your car's in the shop, you don't decide to stay home. You say, all right, I might carpool, I might take the bus, I could walk, I could bicycle, I could maybe work from home, but you think of what those options are. You don't decide it's only a binary decision. So when it comes to some of the things that we face and other countries faced, we had, the other example, if there's going to be a bad hurricane or a storm, you stock up on extra food and you make sure there's gas in the tank. We did not have PPP, personal protective gear. We did not have masks and gowns and all that kind of stuff, and they were inexpensive. We should have had them. So I think those are the kinds of hopefully more level-headed solutions at a time like this than just reshoring. And just to add on nearshoring, I know it sounds really good, but depending on mode of transportation, you may be talking about picking up 10 or 20 days. So I think that I agree with Caroline. Countries that are open to business, that provide a reliable government. One thing about China, there was a reliability of the supply chain and how to do business there, and that accrued to their benefit. And since we are talking about Brazil, and I traveled to Brazil extensively as chairman of the Export-Import Bank under President Obama, and Brazil was not a reliable place to do business. My friend Dave Coady, the former head of Honeywell, would always say, capital is a coward. That if there's uncertainty and rules and regulations are changing rapidly and maybe not stand from one administration to the next, which, by the way, is a problem India has. There is not a sense of, just because precedent is not always relied upon, it does retard investment. It does retard putting capital to deploy into places like that. So that's a critical issue, and that's a hard issue for any country, and I imagine a hard issue for Brazil to address.
Could I weigh in quickly on this, Daniel? Because this is very good points. Yeah, that Caroline and Fred raised. All of those things, making your domestic government policy environment more reliable, making it a more friendly place to do business, reducing paperwork, all those things, it can help trade. It will also definitely help your domestic firms, both to provide services and goods to the domestic economy, but also to the international economy. So you'd be doing things that are good for the domestic economy, domestic firms, domestic workers, but also good things for foreign firms and international trade.
But Bob, it does things for domestic firms writ large. It probably doesn't do well for those who have
benefited from the uncertainty
and have a personal relationship with the power structure, because that is threatening to them.
That's right. Yeah,
I mean,
those vested
in the
interests.
United States, going into the 80s, GM, Ford, and Chrysler had 90% of the auto market. Today, they have 50%. The result, though, is we have better cars, cheaper cars. They run easily 100,000 miles, and that was not the case beforehand. I know I'll be controversial. I'm not working for the government anymore. It's much easier when you don't work for the government. I think trade saved the auto industry. I think left to its own devices, our auto industry would be a fraction of the size it is. And today we actually can export vehicles because of the competitive pressure of imports and the innovation of imports made our vehicles better and made them much more globally competitive. So to your point, Bob, yes, but that does disturb, I promise you, GM, Ford, and Chrysler, we're not thrilled to let other companies come in and take their market share.
It's actually a great example for Brazil, because my understanding is that the auto market in Brazil is very protected. And I looked at this some time ago, so I won't get the exact numbers right, but the exact same model Ford was like 20% more expensive in Brazil than in the United States because of the same exact types of restrictions, and couldn't agree more with Fred about what that cost us in terms of lack of competition. I remember as a kid in Chicago getting in the Dodge Dart in the morning with my mom, and it was cold in Chicago, and we'd just sit there and pray the car would start. But once the competition came in from Japan, all cars got so much better, so much cheaper, and it's better for everybody.
Yes, I do agree with you. And we have challenges in taxes, complexity, and high cost for the industry. We have challenges in infrastructure in Brazil, but we won cost of capital. It was a high cost, and now it's a competitive cost of capital for businesses in Brazil. And inflation also was very hard on the business in Brazil, and now it's under control. So Brazil is improving, and I'm sure we're ready to begin to open.
I mean, one of the challenges I've always felt with Brazil, similar to the US, it's a large economy with a lot of natural resources, and in some ways is as you mentioned, less reliant on trade. So I think that was true in the United States as well. Domestic companies could do very well without exporting. And so therefore we were slow in many ways to thinking about trade and exports in a thoughtful, strategic way. And I think that's true in Brazil. It's over 200 million people. It's a very robust market. You can do very well just selling in Brazil. So the impetus, unlike if you're in France or Spain or Germany, you have to export if you're going to actually grow your economy. So partly that need is a little bit less there, and I think there are consequences to that, obviously, which we share in the United States, frankly.
And I think all of you have sort of touched, in a way, into the next question. It's the challenges we have in Brazil, right? As Danielle said, we have the high cost of doing business. Fred, as you said, we have a pretty large domestic market. We still hold on to the idea that buying Brazilian should be a priority, and that could be vested interest plus some sort of patriotism that's still still embedded here. I think the point that Caroline mentioned in the other question, the idea that we should produce everything, and well, if we open, some industries will die, and that is not okay. And I think, Fred, I'll go back to the example that you gave. And you obviously have vested interests and people that want the status quo to remain because, well, for them it works. But for the rest of the country, clearly it isn't working. So you need you need the perfect storm for things to sort of, push through those barriers. What made the US open, for example, its auto market? What worked there? Because we haven't done in decades what other countries have done way before we did. So we're still having the same conversations in Brazil. It's sort of, what do we need to do?
Well, NAFTA, which many people associate with President Clinton, really started with President Reagan, who was afraid of the EU. And as the Europe was uniting, he saw that as a competitive threat and started the process moving forward on agreements with Canada and Mexico. It was ultimately negotiated by his successor, but it was actually Bill Clinton who had to get it through Congress. So people always think about it as Bill Clinton, but my point is, it came out of fear. It came out of fear of the US losing ground. So, fear is regrettably a very good motivator. All of us remember when we're in school, when it's exam time, there's a bit of terror and fear going on that you want to make sure you do well and don't have to take the course over. So that pushes you to study harder and make sure you're going to do a good job. So fear is one thing. I think that, and I think the US partly was an open market. I mean, it goes to the founding of our country, trying to get away from a monarchy, away from also the monopolies that the crown had in Britain. And so part of that is, it is a little bit in our DNA. Unfortunately, so are guns in our DNA. We have a lot of things, some good and some bad, but the entrepreneurial spirit and the sense of openness, that's a good part of our DNA.
Yeah, and maybe just to add to what Fred said, in addition to fear, I think reciprocity is really important. So Brazil has double-digit tariffs on a number of industries that are important to the US: nuclear reactors, plastics, chemical products, optical equipment, electrical machinery. And US, of course, now has, I think the tariffs were converted to quotas on Brazilian steel, one of the main exports to the US. So there's a deal to be made. And while, one of the few things economists agree on is that free trade is best, and I'll have to qualify that and say most economists, it's very hard to get there on your own because of special interests. And for large countries, there might be some terms of trade gains at times to having tariffs. But reciprocity works because then there's someone who's clearly gaining. And so that's the advantage of a trade agreement that's really around free trade with partners, with natural partners. And so that, and I think Brazil, maybe is moving in that direction, but it seems like, for example, the EU agreement is going to move very slowly with the current Brazilian administration and the view in Europe, as well as issues around climate, et cetera. But those would be one way of getting an industry that's actually supporting trade, is really to have the export industries gain from opening in the other market. The problem is that the losers, they don't lose a lot, but they're very concentrated, very loud. There's a lot of loss aversion. The gains come in the future to industry. So that group's not yet highly organized. And the consumer gains are very dispersed, and consumers don't make a good lobby. So that's where reciprocity and fear, I guess, are other ways of organizing government and industry around opening.
I think Caroline said it so perfectly well. And particularly future gains are always discounted. It's like saying, we're going to cut your taxes in 3 years. You go, I'll believe it when I see it, and I'm not even sure it'll ever happen. So I think there is we assign much lower probability to future gains, but anything we lose, we feel immediately.
If I could weigh in a little bit on this.
First,
I think Fred mentioned NAFTA, And one of the interesting things of the economic analysis around NAFTA is that while the political debate got pretty heated and was associated with offshoring and outsourcing of jobs, the US labor market actually adjusted pretty well. The labor market institutions at the time and just the other forces affecting the labor market, the disruption from NAFTA was relatively small. What happened after NAFTA had quite a different impact on the US economy in the sense of the rise of China and rising imports from China. And labor markets didn't adjust very well. And when workers lost their jobs, particularly low-skilled workers in industries competing with the imports from China, there weren't other low-skilled jobs to go to. Labor market mobility dropped a lot, so people didn't move to where the new jobs were. This was part of this regional thing I was talking about, a shift of a lot of economic activity in the United States from the Midwest and Northeast towards the South and Southwest. That kind of mobility stopped and workers stayed where there were no jobs. And that had a pretty big negative impact. Where I'm going with all this is I think you need to, if you're going to open up, you need to also be thinking about your safety net policies. But thinking about those safety net policies are also very valuable in thinking about the other forces that may drive change in your economy, technological change, changing consumer preferences, those kinds of things. So thinking about it holistically and making sure that you have coherence between your international policy and your domestic policy is very important. The US did not, in my view, the US did not think about that. It was being warned, government officials were being warned about this, that you need to be thinking about broader adjustment domestic policies. But the trade negotiators would basically say, no, we're talking about trade, we're talking about overall aggregate gains. We don't want to get into that kind of discussion. And I think it ended up, with this populist uprising, which had much more to do with just trade and economics. But, there was no mechanism to take away some of that fear and get comfort with change. And that's what a good safety net can do, is it can bring some comfort. Yes, there may be change, but I'm going to get help to get me through it.
Well, Bobby, you blessedly left the word social safety net, because when you add the word social safety net in our current politics, they go, there you go again, you're talking about socialism. And I go, no, we're not talking about but we have a very weak safety net, and we have a very weak money we put into job training, career training. One of the people I interviewed for the book used the term, instead of lifelong learning, he called it lifelong readiness. Because for many people, the day they finish high school or college is the happiest day of their life, and they are thrilled to be out of school. So I think telling people you need lifelong learning is a real downer. But if you say, you've got to be ready for the future, because automation, robots, technology is changing, and how are you preparing yourself and demanding your employer prepare you, not when you lose your job, but so you don't lose your job. And so that's a change we have to make.
By the way, Fred, I was a Soviet specialist.
Brazil would be wise to do that. What's that?
Fred, I was a Soviet specialist. So I wrote my PhD dissertation, invested a lot of time, learned Russian to be a Soviet specialist. The Soviet Union went away. And I could have stayed as a Russian specialist, but I decided I would adapt to a changing world, right? So I really also had to retool. Quite a few years out of graduate school, I was basically teaching myself a whole different set of skill sets. Yeah.
So talking about fear and talking about jobs, losing jobs is certainly the biggest fear when we talk about decreasing tariffs. Are there good examples of public policies that can help mitigate it? And Fred, you mentioned in your book, and I think you're entitled to show again because it's a wonderful book. So
If you
Everyone-
insist, I hate to do that, but if you insist, I will show it.
I do insist. Trade is not a four-letter word. Yes, it's a wonderful book. And you mentioned a system of compensation to mitigate loss of jobs and, well, closing factories. There's all sorts of fear around this. So how can we help our colleagues in Brazil to deal with this fear in a positive way?
You know, Caroline mentioned very astutely, obviously, the benefits of trade are spread far and wide. And as Bob also said, the pain is often highly concentrated. You listen to Bernie Sanders and said, 1 million jobs are lost due to NAFTA. Well, over 40 years, that's 25,000 jobs a year. We were creating along the lines of 2 million jobs a year. So now, however, if you're the 25,000 people who lost their job and your community was hollowed out, that's a real problem. And so when we look at it at a macro level, it's very different. One of the things that I think we're looking at in our country, and you'd have to educate us a little bit on Brazil, is you need a good tax system. You need a tax system that those who are really benefiting and are doing very well are taxed in a way so that some of those benefits are able to be spent on education, on worker training, on social safety net, on a number of those things to make sure that the benefits are spread further and wider. And so
You've seen this in other countries?
Well, I mean, we used to do a better job of this in our country, I would say. I mean, when income taxes started in our country in 1913, there was a real movement about robber barons and making sure that they paid. But interestingly, over the next 75 years or so, and I think President Reagan had a lot to do with this, it went like, we can tax the job creators. We can tax the entrepreneurs. Of course we can. What other country would they do so well? We just have to get over that. Yes, they can be taxed. Now, both capital and businesses are more portable today and can move more easily. And one of the things I think this COVID crisis has made with working from home and Zoom and so forth has made everything more portable. But a tax system is an important part of that. And it's not easy to design. I don't want to be glib about it. It's hard to design a good tax system that really collects the right revenue from the right activities and distributes it through good programs.
And in terms of a country that is a good example, I think most people point to Denmark and their model of flexicurity, where it's really about protecting the worker when laid off and retraining, but having very open business regulations, easy to start a business, easy to close a business, easy to lay off, so that you have the flexibility for the business sector, but you at the same time have the protection for the worker. And when industry has offshored from Denmark, I think Lego did at some point, the workers weren't as upset because they knew they'd be protected, they knew they'd be retrained, and they knew it was important to keep their own company growing. But I want to add one point, and I think Bob alluded to this earlier, talking about technology, that technology has a lot of the same effects. So I just moved, and in my house, I have something really funny. It's a trash compactor. And I tried putting trash in it to see what it does, and it spins the trash around, but nothing is actually compacted. The trash compactor is from 1992. Or actually, I should say the company went out of business. The company that made the trash compactor went out of business in 1992, no longer exists. So the point is that company went out of business because it's probably a bad product that nobody really wants in their house anymore, nothing to do with trade. Most houses don't have these anymore. So technologies also change, demand changes and shifts. Right now, we have this huge shift during COVID from services to goods and shortages. So people lose jobs for many different reasons, and trade is just a small portion of this. And I think we have, and what's so great about the Danish program is it's for any type of job loss as long as it's no fault of your own. And I think this is critical because I think when we focus on things like trade adjustment assistance, it makes it seem like foreigners offshoring trade are the main reasons people lose jobs, when there are plenty of other reasons as well that jobs disappear, again, through no fault of the workers. And I think all of those workers deserve protection. And also by not, focusing it on trade, you don't make trade the target, because one thing that's come up in this conversation, I think right at the beginning from Fred, is this kind of xenophobia that comes with trade. It's the foreigners. It's easy to blame trade, much more so than to blame technology. So these models of, flex security, most countries don't have the type of income Denmark has to afford it, but we can certainly learn something. US does have enough income to be doing far more than it is. And I'm less sure of the situation in Brazil, but something to think about.
And I would add to that, by the way, you want to start early. You don't want to wait until you're well into the transition. You want to be thinking about a good safety net and a well-designed one to deal with these other forces that are at play that you want to unleash. You want technological change. You want a dynamic consumer sector. By the way, if I could, Caroline, you said you want to protect the workers. And I would add, and you did indirectly, but I think it's good to say it very directly, protect the workers, not the job,
Yes.
right? So, and that is a problem. We have a tendency to want to preserve and protect a specific job when, for various reasons, those jobs may not be the jobs the economy really needs, or should be having. You want to help workers move to where there's a more dynamic job sector, but that may require retraining. It may require actually helping some, depending on their age, help them leave the workforce early. But you don't want to just keep throwing money after bad jobs. And there are all these calculations, Daniel, and I think I sent you some studies that essentially talk about what's the cost for each job saved from some of these protectionist measures. And they're usually large multiples of the salary of the job that would have been lost. So, and we economists are good at calculating those things, and I think we're pretty good at it. But that's not often the argument that's going to win the case. And I think it goes back to this notion that I talked about. People and companies are resistant to change. So you've got to find a way to have people be more accepting of it and help build in a dynamism to your economy and make sure that they feel some sense of security. And that's a good name, flex security, that the Danish gave their program.
You know more about the Danish? Bob, do you have more information about the Danish that Caroline mentioned?
Well, we do. And, I know we reference it in a joint World Bank, IMF, WTO study that we did a few years ago. And then we have a research paper that talks about the WTO, and I'll send it to you, that talks about some of the various approaches to job security that are out there, or safety nets as we prefer, rather than not job security, safety nets. See, I fell into the trap myself. I talked about job security when we want to talk about worker security.
Yeah, and it's passive and active labor market policies. So the passive ones are to provide a cushion for when you're out of work, so unemployment and things like that. Then the active ones are to retrain workers, to have these kinds of matching programs for workers and firms and so forth, that can be quite effective. Then there's further you can go with public works, but I think the evidence that those are cost effective, unless you have a shovel-ready project you really want to do, is a bit more limited.
And I think this is truly interesting, and Bob sort of segue into the next question, because all of these arguments are economically, they make a lot of sense, but I think from all of your arguments, when what motivates, there's fear, there's resistance to change. The economic arguments are great, sort of not academically, but when you look at the numbers and to make sense of the numbers, but when they come into play, human emotions become a bigger part of it. And I thought it was really interesting, Bob, that the WTO report, big study that we had, actually did mention that one of the challenge that trade faces is that this is a conversation that mostly happens between economists, that it shouldn't. It should be a broader conversation. And Fred, this is, I think, why your book was so special, because it's very personal. It's not about economics. It is, but it isn't. So I think the question, and I know that we're talking more than economics here, is how do we think about new ways to overcome the fear of, well, the industry that I work in will end and I will have no job, and I'm 40 years old and this is the only thing I knew how to do. I don't want to lose. This is who I am as an identity, right? Or for that city, I think, Bob, the US has so many great examples of that. The Rust Belt, cities that, just as you said, they just didn't adapt. And I think, as Brazil wants to do that, we certainly want to learn from mistakes or things that other countries didn't do that well. And as much as you can have great policies put in either by the private sector or the public sector, there is a conversation that needs to happen before. And I wonder if, from everything you guys have seen, you have suggestions of, this is a good conversation, this is a good example, these are arguments that do resonate. This is how you can really try to get people motivated to change. I used to be a bus driver and now I'm going to be, I don't know, a nurse practitioner or something. But it truly is about fundamentally changing what people do, and putting them in a much more technology savvy environment. And people were scared. I mean, we're scared of doing things that are different. So how do you see that, that fundamentally human element to the impact of trade?
If I may, I think COVID actually provides an enormous opportunity right now on this exact question for two reasons. One, it's not that the government should step in. The government absolutely had to step in the midst of COVID because people couldn't go to work. And so now there's much more of an appreciation, I think, around the world of the need for government to protect people, to protect livelihoods, to protect workers. And so I think that's one side of it. The other is the enormous shifts we've seen in terms of what people consume, how technology is used, the importance of trade, et cetera, have made people more open to do things they wouldn't have done before. I was speaking, we're hiring for a new assistant dean, and the headhunter told me that people are much more responsive when she reaches out and they're working from home than they were when pre-COVID. My own personal experience, I was working in a basement at home when the call came from a headhunter around UCSD. I'm not sure, it might have been a different response I had if I was sitting in my office at the World Bank. We learned that we could do something we never thought we could do. I remember those first 3 weeks of COVID feeling like it was the end of the world. And after a year of working at home, it became the norm. People can change, people can do different things, and we've all learned this. So there's the government side, we've learned the government has to help, and there's the people side. We've learned people can retool, people can do different jobs. And I think we really have to leverage that now, not just around trade, but around technology, around shifts towards technology. We haven't talked much about services trade here, but that's the next frontier. We have telemedicine now. That means it can be provided from anywhere in the world, not just in your locality. So lots of changes happening. And that's one silver lining perhaps we can take from this terrible, terrible pandemic.
If I may, what I wonder is how well are our education systems preparing our citizens for this dynamic world? I know when I was in school, you know, the expectation was you get a job and you'll work in that job for 20 or 30 years and you'll retire from that job, because that's what people's parents did. And I don't remember any class, including going into college, where they were basically trying to say, you know, you might have to engage in lifelong learning and adapting and change. And there was no discussion about, when I was trying to decide what to do with my life when I left, you know, these primary schools, you know, what did it mean for what I was going to encounter in the real world? Fortunately, you know, I had reasonably educated parents. But for lots of other kids out there, there was no way. I think they didn't, what they saw is what they expected to encounter when they moved into the work life. So I think we need to start early to get people to have an education system that not just teaches you the basics of reading, writing, and arithmetic, but also adaptability, the ability to flex and be resilient, and what that might mean in the workplace and other parts of life, actually. And we just don't do that. We leave that to the home. And I think, unfortunately, many homes are not well prepared to think about such things.
I'm going to add, I think, at least in the US, so I need your help, Gabriella, to how this might work in Brazil. But, you know, I think also we had a lot of gender issues. You know, white high school educated males had a monopoly on many, many jobs for decades in the auto factories, in manufacturing and so forth. And over time, women began to enter the workforce, immigrants, people of color, and no monopoly likes to give up its power joyfully and voluntarily. So I think that created some of the strife in our country. You know, we had a lot of hand-wringing about coal workers, and I am concerned, and field workers. Far more women and immigrants lost their job in retailing in 1 year than those industries employ in total. And there was not a lot of concern in our country about what about all these retailers who have lost, retail workers who have lost their jobs. Now, sometimes they're not the primary breadwinner, but many times they are. So I think there are some gender and class issues that have a heavy overlay on these issues.
Well, I think
just let me comment on that as well. Heard that France has a government institute to promote reskilling for quite a few years. I don't know if you have any information of the development of that and other initiatives like that that are good examples. In your country,
I don't off the top of my head.
But I think one thing Bob mentioned, one thing I think we are seeing in our country is different localities are addressing it. There's some programs that happen nationally, but different localities have better adapted and retooled to meet changing conditions, either in industry leaving, particularly if you had a small community that was reliant on one particular company or industry. Some did a better job of retooling than others. So local initiative, local leadership, local colleges, community colleges have a large say and factor into how well communities can retool. So it doesn't only have to happen at the federal level.
Yes.
I absolutely agree, Fred. Absolutely.
I mean, you gave a great example.
Yeah, well, and I do think that, you know, I see this globally. I see it in the European Union. You blame Brussels for everything. In the United States, you blame Washington for everything.
Right.
When in reality, the local communities do have a lot of influence and power and capabilities to do things. It's just easier. It's almost like blaming the foreigner, except that here you're blaming the federal government for not taking action. So, but if I could tell a little story from lunch today, at lunch, you know, I'm a professor at the Graduate Institute, and one of our colleagues is leaving and taking a position in his homeland, China. And we had lunch today, and he was telling me that, you know, it's really changed in China, that his generation went to the United States to learn and get educated, and bring that back to China. And now the Chinese are off, the newer generation of China is like, we got nothing to learn from them. Now, part of that's a broader political dynamic, but he's very concerned that a dynamic, fast-growing country like China is going to lose its edge by essentially turning too inward. And, you know, I think that's a very powerful observation. And this guy's going to a leading university in China. And, you know, he's a pretty open-minded person. And he's concerned about this social dynamic. We figured it out. We can sit back, we can relax, and we can do everything on our own now. And I think that that cultural attitude is something to be concerned about, whatever country you're in.
Well, I think you make a good point, Bob. You know, the whole China 2025, you know, China would be, this is a slight exaggeration, but Greg Yip and I talked about this at the Wall Street Journal. You know, they would like to minimize imports and make as much as they can themselves, particularly in critical industries. And so there's an inherent dislike of the outsider. I mean, they did build the wall. But countries that have been more open to imports, which is something you mentioned at the opening, Daniel, means you're open to more innovative ideas that come from overseas, that come from someplace else, that make a difference. And that is, Brazil is tough to penetrate in that regard. I never will forget one of your trade ministers, when I met with him and was talking with American businesses, he said, Brazil is no place for amateurs. Now that's probably generally true, but you would like not to be quite too proud of that. You'd like that to be something you'd like to rebut versus as a badge of courage.
Yes, even though the international relations is one of the most known courses. Students are looking for this course more than any other, even though education is not focused on foreign trade. And I do believe that education needs to be aligned with taxes and incentives to industry to open. And I suppose South Korea did it because they have a very good education system and they changed themselves for the last 30, 40 years in a very impressive way. And they're very open.
A lot of what South Korea did was invest in the fundamentals, infrastructure, education, and stable institutions. You know, they weren't perfect, but it was a dramatic improvement over the previous status quo. And it really helped them become a very, very competitive economy.
Yeah. So, certainly, another question, certainly becoming an open economy today is a lot more different than when Germany or the US did, for example? Are there good recent current cases that Brazil could look at for inspiration? Caroline, you mentioned in a conversation about Colombia that they have a project. I mean, if we look into opening barriers in a pandemic environment, or let's say the local competitiveness are not at its excellence. So is there a right moment for opening or not?
Well, sooner is better because you're giving up all your potential gains by waiting. So I would say sooner is better. There's no time like the present. So if you think about the countries that have grown fast, they are countries that have opened up. And the Asians are a clear example. You mentioned Korea, which certainly grew through an export-led type of model. We see China having taken that same path. Japan have taken it before Korea, and Vietnam following now. It's harder to think of a good example in Latin America. Perhaps Chile is the closest, where it is very low tariffs, lots of trade agreements, and a much more competitive economy, and grown somewhat faster than the rest of Latin America, though in some sense they're hurt by being surrounded by countries that haven't followed that path. Colombia is, I don't think there's a lesson yet from Colombia. We'll see if our internationalization mission that's being led by Ricardo Hausman and directly reporting to the vice president, what kinds of lessons come out. But we're really thinking about the technologies and productivity gains that come from trading. That, as I said at the beginning, whether it's focusing on your own comparative advantage, bringing in parts and components you can't produce so you can produce something else, and expanding in that through value chains, but shifting resources to their most competitive uses and upgrading on the technology front that comes with openness to new ideas. For Colombia, one issue has also been immigration, where they have relatively strict policies and procedures for access to visas, even for very well educated. So that's preventing ideas from coming into the country, preventing businesses from locating there who want to bring in managers from outside, and the technologies that would come with that. So looking beyond just trade, at immigration, at the own internationalization plans of companies, and getting the private sector really to take part in this internationalization mission. So this is, we're going to have a series of detailed recommendations for the government, and we'll see what comes of it. But that's one place to start if you have a government, that's keen on reform.
I would add, Costa Rica's had a fair amount of success in opening up and laying out a strategy for engagement into global value chains, and picking and choosing certain sectors where they feel that they could upgrade. And they've had a fairly dynamic economy, with some of those sectors have risen and then fallen, but they've had other sectors rising up. I think Mexico is an interesting example. And one of the reasons it's an interesting example, because it does illustrate that you can have a very good plan, but it's still risky. So Mexico's economic development plan, implemented largely through NAFTA, ended up having to compete with China, because China's economic development strategy actually mimicked quite a bit, at least into the sectors that Mexico thought that it was going to be able to grow and develop. And so it wasn't that Mexico's strategy was bad, it's that they were not aware, probably could not be aware, that China was going to implement a strategy and was going to be very, very successful at it, and actually had certain natural advantages: lower cost workforce, better education, more infrastructure investment, more institutional development. So I think it's interesting. People complain that NAFTA hasn't been good for Mexico, but from my analysis, it's really been, it wasn't that NAFTA was bad for Mexico, it's that China's rise was bad for Mexico. I would actually argue that China's rise was, it diminished the ability of other developing countries to rise in a similar pattern, because it sucked a lot of FDI and a lot of concentration of manufacturing capacity in China. And now, because of rising wages in China, you see a lot of that outward FDI into other parts of the region, including Vietnam.
Thinking about, and I'm very conscious that we have to finish on time, but thinking about, Bob, you were talking about Vietnam and China and Asia. There's one question here that is very interesting from Hernan Gallardo, that he said, of course, politics is always a barrier, but if Brazil proceeds to take this step towards global trade, how do you think it will affect or serve countries such as members of the Mercosur? So, are there any positive or negative spillover effects for Mercosur as a whole or the region if Brazil becomes a more open country?
In my experience, a major partner in a regional trade agreement that develops a more dynamic economy typically brings along the other members in that regional economy. If there's an open flow and you allow integration so that you can have upstream suppliers in those other economies. Often it's viewed, oh, they're going to export to us. But actually what you want to look at is how do you make the region more competitive? There's this very broad, diverse group of economies called APEC. They coordinate a lot, and they think holistically about how they're going to integrate. And that's worked out very well in terms of leveraging the growth of some of the faster growing economies in there. And I do think when you look at Mercosur, it's one of those outlier regional trade agreements that really has not done very much at all. Some people say because it's, the agreement as written is not what's actually implemented. But I also think it's got to do with this, rather than viewing the customs union as an integratable unit to help increase competitiveness with the rest of the world, all the members are worried about the other members becoming more competitive in the domestic economy. That's not a good reason to have one of those kinds of agreements. I'll stop there. I'm sure Caroline and Fred maybe have other views on that.
Just to come in, if you look at the pattern of trade around the world, or especially global value chains, 3 regions stand out. You have factory Asia, factory Europe, and factory North America, as Richard Baldwin has put it. And no matter what kind of metric you use, those regions will pop out as the big ones where industries are really well integrated. And it hasn't happened in South America. And it's because Mercosur is much more about protecting inefficient industries than it is about promoting the efficient comparative advantage type ones. And so exactly like Bob said, if Brazil becomes more dynamic, you would actually have more trade in the region because you could have a factory South America where they're all producing what they can produce most efficiently and building those into new products. But the problem is, and as we've been discussing in this session, there's going to be winners and losers, and some of existing industry is going to lose. The auto industry in the region could be really competitive, but the way it's set up to have to produce all parts and components and cars, it's never going to be competitive with the rest of the world. Even in North America, in the auto industries, most of the electronics are coming from Asia, and different parts come from different parts of the world. And it needs to be open to be competitive with the rest of the world, and then all countries will grow. But not every industry will grow. There will be winners and losers, and that's, I think, this other part that we've been focusing on in this discussion.
The other issue is maybe it's the elephant in the room, but a strong nationalist point of view is not helpful to opening your economy, finding trading allies in adjacent countries. So a nationalistic populism, as it's now being executed globally, I should add, is sort of goes against the grain on this. Many of us have an iPhone. I put it in the book. There's over 700 suppliers in something like 140 countries to make up the iPhone. That only with open borders and the free trade of goods could we even have a device like this. So unfortunately, obviously we all have pride. I think those of us here, I think I can speak for Bob, Carol, and myself, we're very proud to be Americans, proud of our country, but we also make mistakes. And being open to that and being open to ideas from the outside is the first step forward. So as you say, what are those examples? Is finding ways, whether it's education exchange programs, there are maybe less charged areas to start to try and open up that there's a sense of a free flow of ideas and people, and the rest may follow.
Yes, we have the example of Embraer in Brazil. It began with a strong university, ITA. I mean, it was the backbone of the construction of Embraer. Right. So it's really important. And I would like to see maybe a few years ahead, all the pandemics and variants we finished and we deal with it, and you may come to visit Brazil and we look back and see the time that you gave us was helpful to open Brazil and make it a better country. So I think we're approaching the final addressing. Gabriela would like to add something.
I don't know if each of you has any quick closing remarks for us to, as Danielle said, any pearls of wisdom that we can leave this first conversation with.
There's an old expression, a crisis is a terrible thing to waste. We've had a terrible global crisis. It demands in some way to clear out some underbrush, and you maybe use that as an example to say we have to really rethink so many things, and this is the reason we have to do it. So perhaps this crisis can spur a lot of thinking and throwing out of some ideas that their time has passed.
I'll invoke. I'll invoke my previous boss, former DG Roberto Acevedo, who used to talk about trade as similar to having to train for football, for soccer, right? It was hard work, but it made you overall much better, right? And so nobody ever really wanted to go run on the field and, exert yourself and push. But it's like competition. It's what makes you better. It's what makes you stronger. And I think trade is like training. It's constant. It's always going. It can make you stronger and make you better and more competitive.
So if we take it a very serious look into this example, in soccer, many years ago, you didn't need to be very technical. It was more of a intuition and training and going. And when you see what Germany did in Brazil in the World Cup a few years ago, it's obvious that training, it's necessary. So I fully agree with Roberto Azevedo that we do need training on trade, otherwise we'll have a 7-0, 7-1 on trade as well. We're losing. We were the 9th economy. We're now in the 12th. It's not 7-1, but we don't want it to be worse.
Right. And training of workers. So we have the training on trade, don't waste this crisis, and also think about, I think, those policies to protect the workers, but not the jobs, is really important. And I'm happy to say, since we're talking about training, that yesterday we have our students just arriving for orientation, and we had a few from Brazil. So please do keep sending students here for training and to learn about trade.
Well, hopefully they do come back, Caroline. That's the intention.
One is
Danielle,
with the government, so surely will.
Okay, great. Danielle, I think the floor is yours to finish.
Thank you. I would like to really thank each of you for your time in preparing and spending your time with us, and I'd like to invite you to keep looking to Brazil, keep in touch, and let's make it happen. Thank you very much. Thank you, Gabriela, and congratulations. All the best.
Thanks all. It was really a pleasure to be here.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.